She didn't know my aunt was a U.S. Marshal. That's the part that makes it so painfully hilarious now. She stood there on our porch, red-faced and smug, yelling into her phone that she was reporting a hostile woman with a weapon, while the actual weapon was probably her own stupidity. The real kicker? My aunt was still holding her garden hose in one hand, watering her flowers like she hadn't just been threatened with arrest by Brenda Whitmore, the self-appointed neighborhood queen. That's what happens when a Karen picks the wrong driveway to stage her meltdown. The whole thing started the first week I came down to visit Aunt Clara for the summer. She lived in one of those neat, polished communities on the edge of town, the kind where the grass is always suspiciously green and the mailboxes all match. I thought it was going to be boring, quiet mornings, lemonade on the porch, maybe the occasional raccoon stealing dog food. Instead, I walked straight into a turf war. And Brenda Whitmore was ready for battle. Now let me paint the picture for you. Brenda wasn't on the HOA board, but she might as well have been its emperor. She had that resting scowl, the clipboard, and the hair that said, "I manage other people's business for fun." First time I saw her, she was glaring at a neighbor's wind chime like it had insulted her ancestors. Aunt Clara had warned me, of course. "We've got a Brenda. Don't feed her attention and she'll usually go back to the HOA lair." But unfortunately, Clara had made a grave error the day before I arrived. She'd put her lawn chair too close to the community green strip. I mean, scandalous. Clearly a declaration of war. I didn't even get to unpack before the drama kicked off. I was halfway through dragging my suitcase inside when I heard the unmistakable snap of a phone camera. Brenda was standing across the street, aiming her phone like it was a radar gun. Clara just kept watering her garden. I was confused until Brenda called out, loud enough for the whole block to hear. "You are violating Section 3 of our community space regulations." I blinked. Clara just tilted her head. "You mean the chair? The one that's not even touching the sidewalk?" Brenda's nostrils flared. "Don't get cute. I've taken a photo and logged your address. This is going in the HOA report." Clara smiled, cool as ice. "Well then, make sure you spell my name right. It's Clara Watkins. With a K. You'll want that for the complaint." It didn't stop there. Brenda was like a wind-up toy once she got going. Every time I stepped outside that day, she found a new thing to glare at: the color of our garden gnome, the fact that Clara's flag was half an inch off center, the smell of grilled chicken from lunch. I'd never seen someone weaponize boredom with such focus. By sunset, I half expected her to crawl into our bushes and take notes, from behind the hydrangeas. Aunt Clara, to her credit, never once rose to the bait. She just kept doing her thing, humming some old jazz tune, and occasionally glancing at Brenda like you might glance at a persistent squirrel on the bird feeder. The real explosion happened the next morning. Clara had invited me out to the front yard to help with the flower beds. It was warm, calm, and honestly kind of peaceful. Then the screech of tires broke the moment. Brenda came marching across the street with that fake urgent walk Karens use when they want the world to know they're in control. Her phone was already out. "You've been warned," she announced like a medieval herald. "And now I'm calling the authorities." I opened my mouth to respond, but Clara gently nudged my arm and gave me a quiet look that said, "Let it play out." Brenda turned her phone so we could all hear it ringing. "Yes, hello? I'd like to report a trespasser. A woman who's become aggressive. She's on my street, and she's threatening me with a weapon. Yes, she has a weapon in her hand right now." Now let me remind you what Clara was holding. A hose. A green, slightly leaky garden hose. Possibly lethal only to thirsty tulips. I looked from the hose to Brenda to the sky, briefly wondering if I'd been dropped into a sitcom. Clara didn't even blink. She just turned the hose off and set it down gently, like she was defusing a bomb. Brenda was nodding along, still on the call. "Yes, I'm at 1142 Elmwood Drive. Please hurry. I don't feel safe." I had to bite the inside of my cheek not to laugh. Clara gave me a small wink. Then Brenda turned toward me and hissed, "You might want to move back. She's clearly unstable." I didn't move. Mostly because I was too stunned that someone could make a fool of themselves this thoroughly in broad daylight. 10 minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled down the street. Brenda practically danced in place. Finally, she breathed. The law. She stood at attention, ready to point out her villain of the day. Clara stepped back and folded her arms, calm as ever. One officer stepped out, tall and young, scanning the yard. Then his eyes landed on Clara. And something shifted. "Marshal Watkins," he said, startled. Clara gave a small nod and a friendly wave. "Hey there, Reynolds. How's your dad doing?" The second officer, still by the door, blinked in confusion. Reynolds turned to his partner. "She's federal. Off duty, but—" he trailed off. Brenda, to her eternal credit, didn't get it. No, she interrupted. "She's lying. She's been threatening me. She was holding a weapon. Look." She pointed at the garden hose, which now looked about as threatening as a pool noodle. The officers exchanged a look. And that's when I knew this summer was going to be anything but boring. Brenda had picked the wrong driveway, the wrong woman, and definitely the wrong profession to mess with. Brenda didn't take the news well. That my aunt was a U.S. Marshal, I mean. The way her face dropped when Officer Reynolds addressed Clara with full respect was something I wished I had on camera. Her jaw twitched, lips parted slightly, and for the first time since I got here, she didn't have anything to say. But that silence didn't last long. Brenda was the type who believed if she said something loud enough and often enough, it became law. So she squared her shoulders, narrowed her eyes, and tried again. "There's got to be a mistake," she said, voice trembling between outrage and disbelief. "She threatened me. She's harassing the neighborhood. You can't just let her get away with that because she has some fancy badge." Officer Reynolds kept a polite but distant expression, clearly trying not to laugh. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "Marshal Watkins is well known to our department. And as far as I can tell, she's standing on her own property watering flowers." Brenda's nostrils flared like a horse about to charge. "You're just taking her side because she's part of the boys' club, huh?" she barked. Clara let out the smallest chuckle and said, "Sweetheart, I've arrested more boys than I've ever clubbed." That should have been the end of it. Any normal person would have accepted the embarrassment, quietly returned to their porch, and maybe reevaluated their life choices. But Brenda was committed. She backed off that day, sure, but I could see her calculating. Brenda wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. The next morning, we woke up to something truly absurd. There, taped to Aunt Clara's mailbox, was a bright pink envelope labeled "Notice of Violation." I opened it out of curiosity, and nearly choked on my cereal. It was a printed citation, accusing Clara of 6 different infractions, ranging from improper lawn ornamentation to unapproved garden hose usage. At the bottom, in flowery script, was Brenda's full name signed like it was a wedding invitation. Clara just raised an eyebrow, folded it neatly, and slid it into her kitchen junk drawer like it was a receipt for takeout. But Brenda wasn't finished. Oh no. That same afternoon, she set up what I can only describe as a makeshift courtroom near the community mailbox cluster. She had a little plastic table, a stack of printed forms, and a cheap speaker playing classical music like we'd all wandered into HOA night court. Several neighbors wandered over out of curiosity. Most didn't want to get involved, but a few hovered in that awkward way people do when they're hoping for drama but pretending to get the mail. Brenda stood at her station like a stern librarian who caught you dog-earing a book. "Due to repeated violations of our neighborhood standards," she announced, "a formal mediation process is now in session." She gestured at her folding chair. "The accused may present her defense." Clara, who had been quietly walking our dog down the sidewalk, stopped. She blinked. "You want me to sit in your chair and explain my flower pots to you?" Brenda nodded sharply. "This is how order is restored." Clara looked at me, then at the dog, then back to Brenda. "You're holding a hearing, at the mailbox?" Brenda, missing all humor, replied. "The bylaws allow for ad hoc assemblies in communal areas." Clara didn't sit. She just leaned slightly on the leash and said, "Well, I didn't bring a lawyer, but I brought a witness who poops in public. Will that do?" The crowd stifled laughter. Brenda's eyes narrowed. I thought that might have shut her down, but instead, Brenda pulled out a clipboard stacked with printed papers and started passing them out like she was running for office. Each one was a list of Clara's violations, complete with blurry, zoomed-in photos of our yard and bullet points that made absolutely no sense. Excessive floral density, one read. Another accused Clara of unauthorized stone placement. I didn't even know what that meant. Was she referring to the decorative rocks around the garden? Brenda pointed to one photo with a triumphant air. "See this? That gnome is positioned in a way that faces directly into my window. That's a clear intimidation tactic." Clara tilted her head. "You think my garden gnome is threatening you?" Brenda's voice rose half an octave. "I know when I'm being watched." Clara turned to the small group watching and said, "If the gnome testifies, do I get a reduced sentence?" That earned her a laugh from at least two neighbors. Brenda was losing ground fast, and she knew it. The next move in Brenda's plan came later that evening, and this one was actually kind of creepy. I was sitting in the living room when Clara's motion detecting camera pinged. We checked the feed, and sure enough, there was Brenda tiptoeing across the yard in the dark, phone in hand, taking photos of the side of our house. She looked like she was on some kind of secret mission, stealth mode activated. Except, her flashlight was on, and she tripped over a sprinkler head halfway through. Clara didn't go outside. She just saved the footage, forwarded it to someone in her department, and poured herself a glass of iced tea. "Let her build her case," she said. "We'll let the evidence speak for itself." I was amazed. Most people would have lost their cool by now. Clara? She was playing the long game, and she knew Brenda was digging her own grave one false accusation at a time. The next day, Clara called a few of the neighbors over. Not for anything dramatic, just a casual backyard coffee. It turned into an impromptu community catch-up, and naturally, Brenda's antics came up. Turns out, we weren't the only targets. One neighbor had been fined by Brenda for uncooperative Halloween decorations. Another got a note in their mailbox complaining about suspicious wind chime activity. No one had ever called her out because she was so aggressive and relentless. But now that Clara was standing up to her, others were starting to speak up too. That afternoon, the final fuse was lit. Brenda tried to file a formal complaint with the actual HOA board about Clara. Except, here's the twist, Greg, the HOA president, is an old friend of Clara's. He didn't know she lived in the neighborhood yet. He came by to personally introduce himself, and thank her for keeping things calm despite the usual neighborhood friction. Brenda saw him shake Clara's hand and froze. I watched her from our front window as she paced back and forth on her porch, clearly torn between rage and the dawning realization that she might have picked the absolute worst person to feud with. By sunset, I could feel it building. Brenda wasn't going to back down. She'd failed at humiliating Clara through bogus violations, fake community trials, and late-night surveillance. She only had one card left to play: the police. Again. And as crazy as it sounded, I had a feeling she was going to try it. Only this time, it wasn't going to go the way she thought. Not even close. I should have known something was up the moment Brenda vanished for a day. Not a single glare from her across the street, no passive-aggressive walks past the yard, not even a suspicious rustle in the bushes. The silence was unnatural. Brenda wasn't the type to give up, she was the type to regroup, replan, and reload. So when I stepped out onto the porch the next morning and saw her pacing by her front door in heels and full makeup like she was waiting for a news crew, I got that pit-of-the-stomach feeling. It was about to happen. Round 3. And this time, she wanted a show. I was halfway through my coffee when the first patrol car rolled down the street. Brenda's posture straightened instantly. She adjusted her blouse, flipped her hair over one shoulder, and did that tiny jog-in-place thing people do when they're trying to look surprised but have clearly been preparing all morning. A second squad car followed, then a third. It was overkill. Dramatic. Completely unnecessary. But exactly Brenda's style. She waved them down like she was directing traffic at a parade. "They're here! Officers, over here!" she called loud enough for the whole block to hear. People started peeking through blinds and front windows. Brenda had just dialed this entire neighborhood into her personal theater, and the show was about to begin. Clara came out onto the porch behind me, sipping from a mug that read, "Not today, Karen." She took one look at the patrol cars, then at Brenda, and sighed. Brenda launched into her speech before the officers could even step out of the vehicles. "She's been threatening me," she said, voice trembling with fake emotion. "She's been stalking my house, intimidating me with that badge of hers. She's abusing her power. I am scared for my life." She pointed at Clara like she was naming the culprit in a murder mystery dinner party. The officers, clearly uncomfortable, looked at each other, then back at Clara. One of them, an older guy with a clipboard and a no-nonsense face, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Clara, "we got a call about alleged intimidation and harassment. We're going to need to ask you a few questions." Clara nodded, calm as ever. "Of course," she said, then motioned toward the side of the house. "But you might want to take a look at this first." She led them to a small box mounted on the wall beside the porch, one of those smart security systems with full audio and video recording. Clara typed in a code, scrolled through the footage, and pulled up last night's greatest hits. There was Brenda, pacing at the edge of our lawn at 1:17 a.m., holding her phone flashlight in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. There she was again, crouching beside our flower bed at 3 a.m., taking photos of the gnome from 6 different angles. There she was, again, at sunrise, sticking another envelope on our mailbox and mumbling to herself. Clara pressed pause and turned to the officers. "She's been surveilling my property for the past 3 nights. I didn't report it. I figured she'd wear herself out eventually. But now that she's calling in false reports, I'm going to need a formal record." The older officer rubbed his forehead and muttered something under his breath. The younger one turned to Brenda, who had stopped posing and was now visibly sweating. "I didn't trespass," Brenda snapped. "I stayed on the sidewalk." Clara calmly clicked to another video, this one clearly showing Brenda's feet stepping onto the lawn. And another, where she knocked over the sprinkler and cursed under her breath. "Sidewalk, huh?" Clara said, folding her arms. The older officer looked at Brenda and asked, "Ma'am, did you enter her property without permission?" Brenda's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to push the lie through but couldn't get it past her teeth. And then came the best part. The officer stepped back, keyed his radio, and quietly called for someone to check Brenda's record. It wasn't loud, just a routine check. But Brenda heard it. She panicked. "This is harassment," she cried. "She's turning the police against me. She's dangerous. She has authority, and she's using it to make me look crazy." The irony almost knocked me over. Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just stood there, cool and silent, letting the weight of Brenda's own words do the work. A few moments later, the reply came over the officer's shoulder mic. It was quiet, but we all caught the key part. Brenda had 3 unresolved complaints already on file, 2 for harassment by neighbors, and 1 for filing a false report against a mail carrier last year because she didn't like the way he looked at her dog. The officers exchanged a glance that said everything. Brenda, suddenly realizing she might be losing control, tried one last move. "I demand she be arrested," she shouted, stepping toward Clara. "She's dangerous. She's threatening our safety." That's when the older officer stepped between them and raised his hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step back. Right now." Brenda froze, shocked. "Me? I'm the victim." "No," the officer said simply. "You're not. You've harassed this woman for several days, you've trespassed on her property, you've filed at least 1 false police report today, and you've got multiple complaints on record. That's not how this works." Brenda stammered, looking around like someone else might back her up. But the neighbors who'd gathered weren't nodding. They weren't agreeing. Some were filming. Some were smirking. Greg, the HOA president, was shaking his head slowly from the sidewalk. Brenda tried to recover. Fine. Fine. If she's not going to be arrested, then I want to file a civil complaint. I know my rights, she declared, voice shaking. The officer nodded. You're welcome to file a complaint. But before you do that, we'll need to document this incident, including your trespassing, the false report, and the existing complaints. We'll also need to detain you for questioning. Please turn around. For a second, Brenda didn't move. It was like her body rejected the idea that consequences applied to her. Then, slowly, awkwardly, she began to turn. The officer gently guided her hands behind her back and clicked the cuffs into place. The click was so quiet, but it echoed like a firecracker down the street. Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything. But I swear the collective silence from the neighbors watching was louder than a standing ovation. Clara didn't say a word. She just picked up her mug from the porch and took another sip, as if everything had gone exactly how she expected. Brenda was helped into the back of the patrol car, still trying to explain herself through the window, like maybe if she just talked long enough, the cuffs would disappear. But they didn't. The neighborhood felt different after Brenda was taken away. It wasn't loud or triumphant, more like a collective exhale that had been building for years. People walked their dogs a little slower past our house. They waved longer. A few of the braver ones even stopped by to chat with Clara, dropping casual lines like, "Well, that was overdue," or, "About time someone stood up to her." It was like the spell had been broken. Brenda's reign of passive-aggressive terror had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet pair of handcuffs and a very public car ride. Clara didn't brag. She didn't gloat. That wasn't her style. She just went about her day like nothing had happened, though I did notice she hummed a little louder as she watered the roses. There was a peace around her now, a kind of stillness that made it clear she had expected all of this to play out exactly the way it did. I asked her how she stayed so calm through the whole thing, and she just shrugged. "You can't teach a hurricane to stop spinning," she said. "But you can build a house that doesn't blow down." That would have been a solid ending right there. But like all good stories, this one had one last twist to give. 3 days after Brenda's arrest, a black SUV pulled into the neighborhood. It wasn't unmarked, exactly, but it definitely didn't belong to the usual crowd of minivans and crossover hybrids. The doors opened, and out stepped a man in a clean sheriff's department uniform with mirrored sunglasses and a very familiar smirk. Clara spotted him from the porch and grinned. "Well, I'll be," she said, standing up. "Look who decided to drop in." Sheriff Lyle Dawson had known Clara since they were both rookies, back when she still wore her badge fresh and he still had hair. They exchanged a quick hug and settled onto the porch, swapping stories in that shorthand law enforcement way where half the meaning is packed into looks and pauses. I hovered nearby, pretending not to eavesdrop while very obviously eavesdropping. Lyle eventually leaned back in his chair and glanced across the street toward Brenda's house. "So that's her?" he asked. Clara nodded. "That's the one." Lyle whistled softly. "We've had 3 calls about her from your neighbors just in the last 2 days. Guess she's been trying to play the victim card hard." Clara sipped her tea. "Doesn't surprise me. She's the kind who thinks if she's loud enough, truth bends to volume." Brenda had been released the same day she was detained, of course, but not without charges. Filing a false report. Trespassing. Harassment. And now, with video evidence, her name was being passed around more official channels. The sheriff wasn't there to arrest her again, at least not yet, but he made it clear that a court summons was already in the works. "Judge Simmons has seen the footage. She's not amused," Lyle said with a chuckle. That evening, Clara decided it was time to take back her own front yard. Not just for herself, but for the neighbors too. So she planned a barbecue. Nothing too big. Just enough to invite the street and let people know the porch was open again, and the weirdness was over. Greg from the HOA brought folding chairs. The Sanchez family brought empanadas. Even the elderly couple from 3 doors down, who hadn't spoken to anyone in years, showed up with a tray of brownies. Clara set up the grill, I played DJ with my phone, and within an hour, the front yard was the happiest I'd seen it since I got there. And then, like clockwork, Brenda appeared. She didn't storm across the street this time. She didn't shout or throw papers or call anyone names. She just stood there on her porch, arms folded, watching the gathering with narrowed eyes. It was clear she wasn't ready to let go of the fantasy that she'd been wrong. But it was also clear no one cared anymore. A few people glanced her way, nodded politely, and turned back to their conversations. The power she once had, that ability to make people nervous just by watching them, was gone. She was a ghost in her own little kingdom. Clara caught her eye and raised a glass of sweet tea in silent toast. Brenda didn't respond. She turned and went inside, pulling the blinds shut behind her. That was the last time she made eye contact with anyone on our side of the street. Later that night, after the grill was off and the folding chairs were stacked, Clara pulled a folded envelope from her back pocket and handed it to me. "Drop this off in Brenda's mailbox for me, would you?" she asked. I opened it, curious. Inside was an invoice. It wasn't petty. It wasn't cruel. It was just a clean, formal notice of court fees, property surveillance expenses, and damages related to false reporting. All itemized. All legal. And at the bottom, in Clara's careful script, the final line read, "Payment requested by the end of the month. Or we can take this to civil court." I slipped it into the mailbox and walked back across the street under the porch lights, trying not to laugh. Brenda had thrown everything she had at Clara: slander, gossip, intimidation, even the police, and all she'd gotten in return was calm professionalism and an unshakable wall of grace. And now a bill. The final nail in the coffin came from the HOA itself. Greg, once terrified of Brenda's temper, finally stood up during the next board meeting and announced a policy change. From that point forward, no resident could issue or distribute citations without board approval. Any attempt to do so would be considered harassment. And while no one said her name out loud, everyone knew exactly who the rule was for. I left Aunt Clara's house a week later, my suitcase a little heavier with borrowed wisdom. She walked me to the car, handed me a sandwich for the road, and said, "Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, but the pig likes it. Just build a fence and turn on the sprinklers." I didn't fully get it then, but I do now. Some people fight fire with fire. Clara fights it with quiet confidence, a rock-solid sense of justice, and just enough sarcasm to make the flames look foolish. And Brenda? She picked a fight with the wrong woman, on the wrong porch, at the wrong time. Because sometimes the calmest person on the block is the one who could cuff you in 5 seconds flat, right after watering the roses.